And picking up right where we left off with our Worldview DNA and the three elements thereof, we have the story, which we just got done looking at and which is also still in front of us here. We have faithfulness, which is a big, big, big idea in the Bible and one that we want to wrap our heads around clearly in order to bring our world into focus. And then the third piece is going to be mission, which of course, conveniently enough, we will cover next. So part two and element number 2 is faithfulness. Again, I said this just a second ago, but this is a huge idea that we have to get straight in our own minds if we're going to be able to make sense of our lives within the world around us and within the larger story in which we find ourselves. So, jumping right into it then, the story is going to be a crucial foundation and context within which we understand faithfulness. So this little section that is kind of highlighted or scribbled out for us, the era of the church, this is us. And the important thing about this is that we grasp the significance of the fact that we are taking our places, you and me, and every person we will ever meet, incidentally, like it or not, it's inevitable, within this one story. If we look back to the ascension of Jesus, we look back to his crucifixion and resurrection, we look back to the nation and the history of Israel, and we look back to creation, backwards. When we look ahead to Jesus' return and the new creation. Obviously, the crucial bit in the middle then is we are living in one and the very same story. This is where we are taking our places. This is how eternity is going to emerge. America will be forgotten. The 21st century will be forgotten. All of the things that scream for our attention, that fight so hard to define our identities and our lifestyles in the world today, all of that's going to pass away. And when the curtain rolls up, we are going to be individuals and people together who take our places in this story. That is very important. Fortunately, Jesus' first disciples, on more than one occasion, but in a very opportune time for us today, also had a hard time grasping and understanding their place in this story and exactly how things were going to unfold. So on one particular occasion in Luke chapter 19, as Jesus was heading to Jerusalem, the disciples are having this conversation, assuming that the kingdom of God is going to appear immediately in Luke chapter 19, verse 11, which I will throw that up for your reference later. So Jesus, recognizing the disciples are not grasping what's unfolding. If we're in a place today where we're not grasping it, he has left us Luke chapter 19, starting in verse 11, to help straighten us out as well. And it says, he stopped and he told them a short story. And here's how that story goes. A man claimed to be king, and he divested his interests and his resources to his servants, and then he left to go receive his kingdom. And then a while later, he came back and did receive the kingdom, and then he called everyone before him, and everything shakes out, and we'll get to that in just a second. The important bit is there's a tiny gap between verses 14 and 15 where the king leaves and the king comes back. As it turns out, that tiny little gap between verses 14 and 15 is now about 2,000 years and counting. So in actuality, this era of the church has turned out to be much bigger, I think, than any of Jesus' disciples originally suspected. And again, most importantly, that is significant because we are still living in that same gap. When Jesus told this story as he was getting ready to be crucified, resurrected, and ascended, that launched his disciples into this gap, and it's the same gap in which we find ourselves today. Also, consistent with our experience today, no doubt, there are three stereotypical responses to Jesus' claim to be king that he unpacks for us in the story. Number one, there are a bunch of people that when Jesus, the man, claims to be king, they say, "No way, I am categorically opposed to the idea that you would reign over me." And it says a group of those rebellious citizens followed the king and they tried to prevent his appointment. And that, of course, is an extremely common sentiment in the world today. And oftentimes you can even find that within the independent, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps American church. People may be okay with the idea of forgiveness, but it can be quite offensive if you suggest that Jesus is the king and it is him we must obey and it is to him that we must submit ourselves. That whole package can be pretty offensive. That's one of the responses that Jesus strongly predicts. Second, there is a version of the servants, and one of the servants that receives the king's resource in Luke chapter 19, it says that servant basically ducked down and they took a neutral position, presumably not sure if the king would return. So how that would play out in real life, that servant didn't want to risk the ire and perhaps death or beatings or some real punishment from the king's opponents. But also that servant was a little bit afraid that, the king might actually come back, so I don't want to be the opposition. So these servants decide to play it safe. They opt for security. They opt for safety. And they just kind of go about their own business, not siding with either the rebels and not really siding with the king. So they hide the money, and then when the king comes back, they just give it back, having done nothing with it. And then the third option is that there are faithful servants of the king, and these servants evidently believe that the king is going to come back. They believe that he's just, and they take their places in the story as faithful servants. They go about the king's business between the ascension and the return. And then when the king does return, of course, he says to those faithful servants, the servants whose lives were shaped by going about the king's business, "Well done, good and faithful servants." So, the question before us, understanding what faithfulness is, understanding that faithfulness is a matter of lived out, actionable allegiance to Jesus Christ, who is our King, the King who has ascended, the King who is returning. And in that gap between the ascension and return, we are the people living. Faithfulness is allegiance to the king during his absence, according to Jesus in Luke chapter 19. It's not just a belief, although obviously the servants did believe he was coming back. That's why they acted as they did. But it was not belief alone. The same way, acting in good faith, as we often say, that doesn't mean, well, I just have good intentions. No, that means I am going to follow through with my intentions and I'm going to live it out. To be a faithful spouse means I am not just idealizing my marriage or thinking about it or believing that I'm married. It means that my life is shaped as a faithful spouse. So faithfulness to the king, allegiance and loyalty to the king are the parameters and the values, the expressions of faithfulness, which leaves us with the question, who will we be in that story? Will we be the rebellious opposition that is, to be quite honest, offended and appalled that Jesus would claim to be king over us? Second choice would be take a neutral position, keep our heads down, play it safe. For God's sake, let's not be offensive to the rest of the world. Let's not press this whole Jesus is king bit on them. Let's just keep our heads down. If and when he comes back, we won't be his enemies, but we'll just try to slip in Or option number 3 that Jesus lays out for us, will we be faithful servants, believing our King is going to come back, who stake our lives on living to go about his business in the time between his ascension and return? And for all of us listening to this video, we're probably at least leaning toward the latter part. And I would say this for us, to us, regarding the mission. Remember, that same measure, that same threshold, that same story is unfolding for every single person we will ever know. That same story is unfolding for each one of our neighbors. Whether or not they know it, that is their story as well. And whether or not they know it and whether or not they want it to be true, they are also going to have to stand before King Jesus and give an account for themselves between his ascension and his return. So my heart and my prayer for all of us is that we would own that, not only for ourselves, but we would own it for our neighbors, that the way we live, the way we go about our business would be an ongoing invitation and an ongoing reaching out to bring others into the kingdom with us, so that we might have the immense joy and pleasure one day, not only of standing before King Jesus ourselves and hearing, "Well done, good and faithful servants," but we might stand to the side and see our friends, our neighbors, our co-workers, our communities also taking their place before Jesus, and him saying to them, us having had the honor of being part of that redemptive mission along the way, "Well done, good and faithful servants."